Well, hello everybody, it's Histor-Tea time! Welcome back to Histor-Tea time with your favorite teacher, Miss Mullins. Okay, so today we're going to pick up from where we went from last time, and we're going to discuss all of the fighting, all of the battles, everything that took place. Now, I will do a mini series on like various specific battles that took place, but we're going to start with the overarching idea of what in the world happened in World War II. Okay, so in the 1930s, events throughout the world led to conditions that started World War II. We have high unemployment, desperation, feelings of betrayal, and all of this especially was felt by Germany. And it led to the rise of totalitarian dictators. We had fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler, and they threatened to conquer new territories for Italy and Germany. We also had extreme conditions and a need for raw materials that led to a desire for expansion for Japan under Hideki Tojo. Now, this guy was very military focused. Now, by the 1930s, the world was moving towards another war, but few nations were actually in a position to prevent it. Britain and France were the leaders of the League of Nations, and they both wanted to avoid another war. The USA, while we may have been part of the League of Nations beginning, we weren't actually part of it at this point, and we also were dealing with the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929, and so we were kind of attempting to survive. So we didn't want to get involved with foreign affairs at this point. But anyway, so Japan, Italy, and Germany aggressively expanded in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And by 1936, Germany, Italy, and Japan formed an alliance called the Axis Coalition. So throughout anything in World War II videos with me, you're going to hear the Axis powers versus the Allies powers. That's just what they were called. The Axis, think of them as like the bad guys. Right? We had Germany, Italy, and Japan that formed them, and then we're going to have and then the Allies are going to be the USA, Britain, Canada, pretty much anybody that was fighting against them. What's interesting is that you see this Soviet Union switch sides. So we do have Stalin show up, and he's kind of part of the Axis coalition. But then after they break the pact, then he leaves it. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and Manchuria is up here in northern China. And it was done to seize coal mines and iron. And then in 1937, Japan once again returned to northern China. They conquered it, killed 300,000 unarmed soldiers and civilians. Love that. During what's been called the Rape of Nanking. This is a disturbing picture of the skeletons and corpses of 300,000 people. Terrible. Okay, so in 1935, Mussolini began his campaign to create an Italian empire, and he did this by invading Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia is obviously over here in Africa. Okay, the Italian army easily defeated the Ethiopians. Unfortunately, they were outgunned and outnumbered. Here's actually a picture of some Ethiopian soldiers on horseback trying to defend their country. Okay, critical thinking time. How should the League of Nations have responded to all of these things happening? So all of the aggressions happening in Africa and in Asia at this point by Mussolini and by Hideki Tojo, so Japan and Italy right now, how do you think they should have responded? That's what I want to know. Leave that down in the comments. I'll tell you what they actually did. The League of Nations condemned Japan and Italy. So they pretty much said, look, we don't like what you're doing, but we're not going to do anything to stop you because we want to try and maintain peace. Now, riddle me this, Batman. If I'm going to try and have world peace, and there's people that are threatening lives, killing people, stealing their resources, is that peace? It sounds to me like they're trying to confuse peace with quiet. They think that because they're separated by massive bodies of land or water, that it's not going to be a world problem. They think that if they just publicly condemn what they're doing, that'll be enough. Well, it wasn't. Because the failure of the League of Nations to actually do anything to Italy or Japan is what led Hitler to expand Germany. because he's like, well, they're not going to do anything, so I'll do what I want to do then. So in 1935, Hitler defied the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was what was signed at the end of World War I to spark an end to it, and expanded the size of the German military. Now, if you don't remember from my World War I video, the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany cannot have a standing military for more than 100,000 people. So when it's saying that he defied the terms of the treaty, it's because he did this. He also moved his army to the Rhineland, which was also bad. He wasn't supposed to do that. And he obviously was creating a very mechanized army, which was also wrong because in the Treaty of Versailles, it stated that Germany wasn't allowed to manufacture any kind of military weaponry at all. Don't worry, he has a habit of breaking his promises. Both times, the League of Nations refused to actually stop Hitler in order to keep peace in Europe. Again, confusing peace with quiet. This is actually a quote from a Marvel movie, Age of Ultron. Shameless plug. But anyway, love that movie, and Ultron actually says that to the Avengers. Very good quote. He's a terrible villain, but also a very good villain. Moving on. 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, meaning he just absorbed it and took the territory. And then next, Hitler demanded that the western border of Czechoslovakia, right over here, known as the Sudetenland, be given to Germany. Now, number 2, critical thinking question. How do you think the League of Nations should have responded to Hitler's actions? Well, tell me down in the comments below. Number them 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. I'm just going to tell you what they did. In 1938, leaders from England and France both met with Hitler and Mussolini. So technically, we actually had meetings with them. Not we, USA, but like, you know, allies. And it was known as the Munich Conference. And in order to work out an agreement to avoid war, Germany was allowed to keep the Sudetenland if Hitler promised to stop expanding. So essentially what they're trying to say is, look, you can have Western Czechoslovakia, just stop there. Britain and France used appeasement with Hitler, and they gave in to his demands in order to avoid war. This is the British Prime Minister at this time. He declared that he had gained peace for our time. Again, I can't make this stuff up. Marvel, Age of Ultron. Ever seen it? You need to, because these are dropping mad quotes that they recycled from history in the comic books and then movies. It's amazing. 6 months after the Munich Conference, Hitler broke his promise and then annexed all of Czechoslovakia. So, again, remember this, Hitler has a bad habit of breaking his promises. Not that he was a very trustworthy kind of human anyway. So we move on. 1939, Hitler demanded that Western Poland be turned to Germany, but he did not want to provoke a war with the Soviet Union. Because look at Poland. All right, look. He wanted Western Poland. So we have north, south, east, west. He wanted all of this part of Poland, okay? But he knew that if he invaded Poland, the Soviet Union would probably do something. Because, remember, they're all part of the Slavs, right? So what he does is he calls up Stalin, bing bing, and he goes, hey, let's do something. Let's invade Poland together. Interesting. So Stalin and Hitler decided to sign something called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, promising to never attack each other. Oh, stupid. Okay, so secretly Germany and the USSR, which is the Soviet Union, agreed to divide Poland. So what happened was... This is supposed to be Hitler and Stalin. It's funny. So what had happened was, we have Hitler invading Poland from the west, and then literally like a day later, the Soviet Red Army shows up and invades Poland from the east. Did not go well. So September 1st, 1939, this marks the end of the interwar period, which is what I did my other YouTube video on, which was the time frame in between World War I and World War II. But anyway, it all ended on this day because Hitler ordered the German military to attack Poland. Holy crap, everything is just terrible. Now, critical thinking decision number 3. How do you think Britain and France should respond? How do you think they respond? How do you think they should? I'll tell you exactly what they did. 2 days later, September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and this is how we get World War II. This is when it begins. It's terrible. Now, what's interesting about World War II is it has a 2-theater war. World War I was mostly fought on one section of the world, right? In World War II, though, it was fought on 2 separate sides of the United States. So we have Europe fighting, and then we also have the Pacific fighting. So we have the Allies and Axis powers. They convert to total war for the second time in 20 years. So essentially okay, let me back it up. A two-theater war, you're going to hear what's called the European theater and then the Pacific theater. The Pacific theater deals mostly with Japan and anything like Pearl Harbor, Midway, anything like that. And then we're going to have the European theater, which is mostly what Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin are doing. Alright, we got pictures of women in the factories again. We can do it. When World War II began, Germany used a tactic called lightning war. This is a strategy they called blitzkrieg. Lightning war is just what it's translated to. That relied on fast, strong attacks using air raids, artillery, and then tanks. So I have it'll be a super short little video, and essentially what it is it describes to you what blitzkrieg is. It's really interesting, and it's kind of messed up, actually. So, but the Blitzkrieg was done by the Panzer divisions, which Panzer is just German tanks, and then the plane that you see, the aircraft here, belonged to the Stuka bombers, which flew the Luftwaffe plane. Now, so the Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. They're very, very bad. This is them rolling through, I don't know, Poland probably. It's like all of Europe. Okay, by 1940, Germany conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Now, France is important. France, remember, it was Allied territory. And when they take over France, that means Britain by itself is fighting all of the Nazi Empire, which is a lot. As you can see right here, this whole pinkish color, all Axis controlled. Alright, so this is him going through Paris. There's the Arc de Triomphe, and there's the Eiffel Tower. And these are people that unfortunately are sworn to Nazi loyalty against their will. When France fell to the Nazis, Britain was the only nation at war with Germany. In 1940, Germany began a massive bombing campaign using its air force, which ignited the Battle of Britain. Now, I have an entire PowerPoint that's devoted to the Battle of Britain, and I'll go through it. It's actually going to be really cool. It's going to be different than this. This is more lesson geared, especially for my students, but those of you that are watching that aren't my children, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be so cool. There's going to be footage from it, too. The British Air Force fought German planes aided by radar and the ability to crack German codes. And now we have a new British Prime Minister who wasn't going to sit there and do appeasement tactics with Hitler. He actually was like, we're just going to fight you, and we're never going to surrender. That was the whole thing with Winston Churchill. He was actually one of the most powerful weapons that Britain had, because he refused to give Hitler the time of day. Hitler tried to make appeasement with Britain. He tried to say, well, listen, we won't invade you, we won't bomb you as long as you just, like, surrender to me. And Winston Churchill, known as Big Winnie, he was like, no, that's not gonna happen. I have dogs. So what's interesting about him is actually he was known as one of the best orators, which is like public speakers. He actually, as a young kid, had a speech impediment as a child. Interesting. But he gave very famous speeches. There's some where he says, we'll fight you in the hills, we will fight you in the streets, we'll fight you on the beaches, and they will do all of that. They will literally do all of it. It's amazing. Unfortunately, though, this is part of the 50 consecutive day blitz that Hitler and the Nazis launch against London. This is the Tower Bridge, right here. You can actually have tea up there now. It's nice, I've been. So, not for tea, I've just been to the bridge. But, essentially, so what's going on when I say with the Blitz? What that is that Britain was bombed heavily by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, the Stuka bombers. And so we have people hiding out in the subway tunnels, and we have people, building, like, they have little bomb shelters. They have the sirens that go off. I mean, it's pretty intense. And it happens for 50 straight days and nights. It's intense. It's so intense. So after 8 months, Hitler called off the attacks and then focused on Eastern Europe. Now, this is so brief. But essentially, the reason why he calls it off is because there's a massive battle that takes place out in the English Channel. and then there's a lot of other, attacks from Britain that eventually make Hitler stop and realize that he's just going to exhaust his resources and he needs to focus more on Eastern Europe instead of trying to attack Britain. He's like, well, I think we're just going to have to accept the fact that they're just going to kind of be there and we just need to move on. We need to press on, or else we're never going to move forward. So this is at the time the King and Queen of England, and what they're doing is they're with the air raid precaution staff, and they're surveying all the damage that was done to Buckingham Palace when all the bombs were going off. This is Queen Elizabeth right now. At the time, she was Princess Elizabeth, and she was a mechanic during World War II. Okay, Baker Street. The reason why Baker Street is important is because that's the supposed residence of Sherlock Holmes in the books written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, what's really cool is that the King and Queen, George and Elizabeth, they decided to actually stay at Buckingham Palace when their government, the Parliament at the time, they told them that they should leave. You need to flee, you need to go somewhere else, any of the places that you own. Sorry. But they actually said that, no, we're going to stay at Buckingham Palace through the entire Blitz, so they pretty much risked being killed at any given point. This actually won the affection of the nation. They were like, oh man, our King and Queen's going to stay with us? That's so great. It's so nice to know that at least our rich people aren't going to leave us. Okay. Sorry. So the United States vowed to remain neutral when World War II began. However, after the fall of France and the attack on Britain, the U.S. started to sell a lot of war supplies to the Allied powers. So the president for the United States at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And he knows that he knows that Britain needs help. Because essentially Britain and Canada, a lot of people don't even talk about Canada, but Canada declared war on Europe way before we did. And not Europe, but Germany. And so Canada was over there fighting alongside the British as well. In fact, Canada was involved in the attack of D-Day. So, again, no one talks about poor Canada. But Canada was a constant throughout World War II, a good ally. And so we were selling them supplies. We were trying to help them. We were sending pretty much everything except troops, right? Because the whole thing that FDR rode the whole way through getting elected in his presidency was, don't worry, I'm not going to send your boys off to fight another war. That's the whole promise that he made to mothers and stuff. And of course everyone was like super stoked about that because they just got out of the brutal World War I, and they were like, we don't want to do that again. But this actually is what helps us get out of the Great Depression, getting involved in World War II. Because we sell all these supplies, we're making them, we sell them, they buy it, they really need it. So the demand is very high, and that kind of helps us get out of the Great Depression. Anyway, so we got some fun facts. So here we have a picture of a Boeing factory. So this is an aircraft factory in the south of downtown Seattle, and essentially this is what it looks like before. This is the factory, and then this is it covered up with a bunch of props and various things on top of it that covers it up, so that way no one would think to bomb it at all. Who's going to bomb a resident? What's this residential neighborhood going to offer us? Nothing. So let's not destroy it. But a aircraft factory, yeah, that could be potentially important to take care of. So that's why they did that. Here's some more photos of it while I drink my coffee. It's pretty intense, actually. So you can see some of the netting up there. Sorry for this dead silence. Okay. So as you can see, these humans are taller than the house. So from the sky, you can't tell that that's like a short fake house. All you see is rooftops. That's all. That's how you know you're in a residential neighborhood, is the rooftops of these buildings. They don't actually know that it's not a real house. So no one would ever know. Alright, in 1940, Italian and German troops moved to take control of North Africa. Meanwhile, Hitler took control of the Balkans. If you don't know what the Balkans are, please refer to my World War I video when I tell you all about it, and I lay out all the territories for you. Okay. In 1941, Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact, just 2 years later. And and invaded the Soviet Union. So this was called Operation Barbarossa. So Operation Barbarossa was a plan that the Nazis, Hitler, right, his SS generals, everybody, that they all came up with, and they were going to invade the Soviet Union. Because technically, from the get-go, if you actually listen to Hitler's speeches and you like read the translation, obviously for those of you that can't speak German, he always talked about going for Russia. He talked about how much he hated the communists. He talked about how Russia was part of his destiny and that was always the end goal. So honestly, like, and Stalin, like, is recorded that he actually was not totally surprised that it happened. He was just still kind of like, dude, what? When it happened, I mean, you know, because he's just like, it's like disappointed but not surprised. You know what I'm saying? It's one of those moments. Anyway, so of course they made lots of political cartoons. Of course. So what's an interesting fact, though, before we lead up to this, Hitler toured Paris after conquering France, and Hitler made a point of visiting Napoleon's grave. So as you can see, there he is, with all the SS generals. This guy right there, that's Göring. He's the guy that's in charge of, or is this guy? These guys right here, like his top 3 guys. So Göring, Goebbels is over here. These are main SS officers that are in charge of pretty much the mechanics of all of Nazi regime. And then this is Napoleon's grave down here. What is interesting is that just like Napoleon, he makes a grave mistake when he goes against the Russians. He should have reviewed his history book while he was there, because he should have known to not invade Russia during the winter. Okay, and I'll get to that later. By 1942, the Axis powers controlled most of Europe and North Africa, but were unable to defeat Britain and the USSR. So, essentially, at this point, all Axis powers were still kind of in the mix, fighting on both sides. They can't defeat Britain. Britain somehow manages to hold out. Thankfully, I think it's because most of the United States supplies actually make it there pretty quickly, because no one's out in the middle of the Atlantic right now. It's the Pacific Ocean that's got all the turmoil. Because all the fighting's happening here. So this is no, like in World War I with all those German submarines and stuff, that was not the case this time. We didn't have a whole bunch of that. All of it was pretty much land and air, and then every now and then we had a naval battle, but most of the naval battles were right here concentrated within the English Channel and in the Pacific Ocean. Alrighty, so timeline. Meanwhile in Japan, they were focusing on expanding throughout the entire Pacific and then reignited the Japanese Empire. So, from 1939 to 1941, Japan conquered European colonies in Asia, which included French Indochina, and Japan then threatened to take the U.S. colonies of Guam and the Philippines. Obviously, the United States was not thrilled about that. So, critical thinking discussion, or decision, goodness. Number 4. God. How should the United States respond to all of this? I'll tell you what we kind of did. In 1941, the U.S. cut off sales of iron and oil with the Japanese. Japan actually interpreted this embargo as interfering with their right to expand. So, what did they do? They then completely crippled our Navy. So on December 7th, 1941, as FDR said, a day that will live in infamy, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan. The surprise attack actually crippled the United States Navy and killed 2,300 Americans. After the attack, of course, USA declared the war on the Axis powers and entered World War II. So, Axis powers meaning not just Japan, but then also everybody else over in Europe. At the time, though, we were mostly focused on Japan. Because we weren't attacked by Germany, we were attacked by Japan. So, that's who we went up against. We spend a lot of time in the Pacific before we even really do a lot over in Europe. Again, it was a 2-theater war, so we started messing around over here. We started to try to take back all this stuff. We started to stop the Japanese from expanding and kicking people out. Never to justify imperialism or anything like that, but the Japanese also had concentration camps. They did it to the Dutch. They did it. I mean, we had internment camps for the Japanese because what we found out from Pearl Harbor was that there were actual Japanese citizens that were actually spies, and they were giving information to Japan's Navy the whole time. So that kind of sent everybody on a scare, and then they did the internment camps. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese took the Philippines and then threatened to take India and Australia. By 1942, Japan actually controlled a large empire in the Pacific, and they declared that Asia was for the Asiatics. So essentially, all Europeans, all non-Asians need to get out of Asia. You don't belong here. From 1939 to 1942, the Axis powers, which encompassed Germany, Italy, and Japan, dominated Europe, North Africa, and Asia. But 1942 was a turning point for the war. The Allies were actually, 3 years after 1942, finally won, but 1942 was a big, big turning point. We start to get creative, meaning we don't just sit there and do this all-out war mentality. We decide to psych the Axis powers out. We're going to psych them out. So one trick that the Allies used was, from the British side, they actually attempted to trick the Germans with the man who never was tactic. So what they did is, in August 1942 in North Africa, before the Battle of Halfa, a corpse was placed in a blown-up scout car in a minefield, facing the German 90th Light Division, just south of Karat al-Ab. With the corpse was a map showing the locations of totally non-existent fake British minefields. It was a fake map, okay? And the Germans fell for it, and then Rommel, who was an SS officer, he was a general that was in charge of... He was actually a very successful military general, a horrible, horrible, horrible man. But he was a good tank officer, I don't know. But he led his panzers, and they were routed into areas of like soft sand, and all the tanks were bogged down, so they weren't operable anymore. So that was kind of good. Trickery. The Alexandria Harbor. So here we go. I have notes. Have you ever been to the Parthenon? It's the real one's in Greece, but they have a replica one in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's where this came from my best friend Ashley. She's also on YouTube. Go find her. She's amazing. Okay. So the magician, his name was Jasper Maskelyne, and during World War II, he persisted to join the camouflage unit, and after not being taken seriously for a long time, he was finally accepted into the Royal Engineers, which was a British force. He wanted to use trickery and illusion, and so he started the camouflage experimental section, to which he thought was too boring, so he renamed it the Magic Gang. I'm not kidding. He was in Egypt in 1941, and then as the British were scrambling for ideas to keep their supply routes open, and not get bombed, they asked the Magic Gang to help the task, like to create a task force and essentially make the Alexandria Harbor disappear. So what he did is he used cardboard, a lot of shadowing and lighting techniques, and then created an entirely fake harbor. And then what he had done was, in the real harbor, they turned off all the lights. No lighting was allowed over there. Completely dark. And then they turned on all the lights on the fake one, and so then the Germans actually bombed the fake one and did no damage to anything really important at all. And the real one was fine. So, interesting little tidbit there. Alright. Hollywood fakes out Hitler, so a lot of fake encampments were set up with a small team of people with loudspeakers, recording of tanks, rumbling, and mess halls and all that stuff. So this is kind of the idea of poor Britain, but there weren't as many soldiers over there as they needed, right? The Germans had so many, and then they kind of kept annexing and absorbing all these other countries' militaries, so they had so many soldiers. And so what they did to psych them out was they just created these tiny little encampments, but they didn't know that. They didn't know it was tiny. They just created with these small little groups, and then they had all these fake props everywhere and sound loudspeakers and everything. So it made it sound like it was a huge, massive encampment, and it never was. We also had the Seabees. Now the Seabees were actually a mixture of trained soldiers, carpenters, and engineers that solved lots of problems that were that kind of just came up out of nowhere. So for example, like needing an instant pier, which did happen, and an instant airplane runway. So it's crazy. You could go from an area that was almost tropical jungle or total beach or total whatever, and then boom, you could have these fully functioning mechanisms. Alrighty, so we're going to stop here for now. We'll pick up soon.